The moment George Monroe rode into Dustfall, Nevada, in the spring of 1883, every soul on the main street found something urgent to stare at on the ground. Every soul except one. And that one exception would unravel him completely before the summer was done. Dustfall was the kind of town that looked like the desert had given up trying to reclaim it. A stubborn cluster of wooden buildings pressed against the base of red rock bluffs as though sheltering from something. There was Hawthorne's General Store with its faded painted sign, the Silver Spur Saloon where the piano was perpetually out of tune, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a doctor's office that most people avoided because the doctor himself was half-blind and fully drunk by noon. 312 souls lived in Dustfall, give or take a drifter or two, and every single one of them had heard the name George Monroe before he ever set foot on their particular patch of Nevada dirt. He had a reputation the way a storm has a reputation. People felt it before they saw it, and by the time it arrived, they had already made up their minds about how to behave. George Monroe had ridden with the Callaway gang for 3 years somewhere down in Texas. He had supposedly put 2 men in the ground during a robbery outside of El Paso, though nobody who had actually been there was alive to dispute the details. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, and he carried a Colt single-action Army revolver on his left hip as naturally as other men carried pocket watches. He had dark eyes that did not blink often enough, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that formed the bluffs behind Dustfall. He rode in on a gray roan horse that was almost as exhausted as he was, and he stopped in front of the Silver Spur, dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body had taken more than its share of punishment, and tied his horse to the hitching post. Every storefront suddenly needed sweeping. Every woman on the boardwalk suddenly remembered somewhere else to be. Old Pete, who usually sat outside the general store and talked to anyone who would listen, stood up, folded his chair, and went inside without a word. George noticed all of it and did not change his expression. He needed a room, a meal, and at least 3 days of stillness. He had left the Callaway gang 6 months ago under circumstances that were neither clean nor simple, and he had been moving ever since, not running exactly, but not lingering either. Dustfall had come up in conversation at a way station 40 miles back, and the man at the station had said there was a boarding house run by a widow who did not ask too many questions. That sounded precisely right. He pushed through the saloon doors, and the place went quiet in the way that saloons only go quiet when someone, genuinely frightening, walks in. The barkeep, a heavy-set man named Claude with enormous red mutton chop sideburns, kept polishing his glass but kept his eyes on George with the fixed attention of a man planning his exits. George sat at the bar, asked for whiskey and something to eat, and placed $2 silver on the counter without being asked for payment first. That surprised Claude enough that some of the tension went out of his shoulders. Passing through, Claude asked, setting down the whiskey. "Need a room for a few nights," George said. "Heard there was a boarding house." "That would be Mabel Sullivan's place," Claude said. "End of 2nd Street, the one with the blue door. Though I should tell you she has a rule about no firearms in the rooms." George looked at him steadily. "She enforced that rule herself," Claude laughed, and it was a laugh with some genuine amusement in it. "She does, actually, and she keeps a loaded shotgun behind the kitchen door, so it's not as foolish as it sounds." George picked up his whiskey. "Sounds like a woman with sense." He finished his drink, ate the plate of beans and salt pork that Claude's cook produced, and then led his horse down toward 2nd Street. The boarding house was easy enough to find. It was a 2-story wooden structure that was in better repair than anything else on the block. The paint was not peeling, the front steps were solid, and there were curtains in the windows that looked like someone actually washed them periodically. The blue door was exactly as described, a deep, somewhat faded blue that might have been bold once and had weathered into something quieter and more certain of itself. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what he expected. though he could not have said exactly what he had expected. She was 25, perhaps 26, with brown hair pinned up under a practical linen bonnet and gray eyes that were the color of sky before rain. She was wearing a blue calico dress with an apron over it, and she had flour on one wrist, which told him she had been baking. She looked at him the way you look at a man who has knocked on your door directly, with assessment, without particular alarm. That absence of alarm was the first thing he noticed. She had heard the same things everyone else in Dustfall had heard. He could see that she knew who he was. There was a flicker of recognition in those gray eyes, a quick internal cataloging of information, and then she simply looked at him as a person standing on her front step who needed a room. "Mr. Monroe," she said, and her voice was even and unhurried. "I heard you ride in. I have a room on the second floor, east-facing, $7 a week including breakfast and supper. House rule is no firearms kept loaded in the rooms, no whiskey brought upstairs, and no visitors after 9 in the evening. You break those rules once, I give you a warning. You break them twice, you find somewhere else to sleep. Are those terms agreeable?" He had not spoken yet. He realized he was staring at her with a peculiar quality of attention, and he made himself answer. "Those terms are agreeable, Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "though it's been 3 years since my husband passed, so I'm not particular about the form of address. Come in and I'll show you the room." He followed her inside, and the house smelled of baking bread and something with lavender in it, which was so different from the smells he had been living among, horse and dust and gun smoke and other men's sweat, that it almost disoriented him. She led him up the narrow staircase, showed him the room, which was small and clean with a brass bed frame and a washstand and a window that looked out over the backs of the buildings toward open desert, and then she waited for him to either accept it or decline. "I'll take it," he said. "Supper is at 6, she said, and went back downstairs, and that was that. He stood in his clean, small room for a long time after she left, listening to the sound of the house settling around him, and he thought about the fact that she had not flinched once. The other boarders at Mabel Sullivan's house were a drummer named Edwin Pratt who sold patent medicines and was rarely there, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Agnes Foy, who was 73 and mostly deaf but fiercely opinionated at mealtimes, and a young man named Thomas Weaver who worked at the assay office and was 20 years old and homesick for Ohio in a way that expressed itself as constant mild cheerfulness. None of them seemed entirely comfortable with George's presence at the supper table that first evening, but Mabel set his plate down in front of him with the same efficiency she applied to everyone else, and that set the tone. The food was remarkable. There was roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and green beans put up from the previous summer and fresh bread, and for a man who had been eating trail food and saloon cooking for the better part of 6 months, it was the kind of meal that made you aware of how much your body had been quietly suffering. "This is very good," he said, which was perhaps understated to the point of being almost funny, but he was not a man who had much practice with the ordinary courtesies of domestic life. "Thank you," Mabel said, and passed the bread without ceremony. Miss Agnes, who could not hear most of what was said at the table but had an excellent sense for when compliments were being exchanged, nodded approvingly. Thomas Weaver talked about a silver claim that had come through the assay office that afternoon. Edwin Pratt was absent, as usual at some saloon or another. George ate and listened and did not speak much, which was his natural state, and after supper he sat on the narrow front porch for a while and watched the last light drain out of the Nevada sky, turning it from orange to purple to a deep, ink-dark blue, and he tried to remember the last time he had sat somewhere and not been watching his back, and he could not. Over the next several days, the people of Dustfall maintained their careful distance from George Monroe. He was not harassed. The reputation worked in both directions, and nobody wanted to be the one to start trouble with a man who had supposedly killed 2 people in Texas, but he was also not welcomed. The barkeep at the Silver Spur served him because he paid. The man at the livery stable cared for his horse because he paid. Nobody invited him into conversation. Nobody met his eyes for long. He spent his days quietly. He had a horse that needed rest and some repair to its shoes, and while he waited, he found himself at loose ends in a way he had not been in years. The Calloway gang had been, whatever else it was, purposeful. There was always a next job, a next town, a next thing that needed doing. Stillness was unfamiliar to him, and he was not sure he liked it. He began to take walks in the mornings, which was not a thing that most men in Dustfall did, and on those walks he started to notice things. He noticed that the alley behind the feed store was being used as a dumping ground for things that should have been burned. He noticed that the small acequia that ran along the north side of town, which was supposed to feed water to a kitchen garden that several families shared, was partially blocked by debris. He noticed that the front step of the church was rotting through, which seemed like both a practical hazard and a spiritual metaphor that he chose not to think too hard about. On the fourth morning, he found himself outside Mabel Sullivan's house at an hour when she was already in her kitchen garden, which ran along the south side of the house, planting something in the dark soil with the focused, unhurried attention she seemed to bring to everything she did. He stopped at the garden fence, which was low enough to have been decorative more than functional. "What are you planting?" he asked. She looked up without startling. "Tomatoes," she said. "It's late for them, but I have a sheltered spot here that stays warm. They might do." He looked at the garden for a moment. It was well organized, with visible rows and some kind of system to the spacing that suggested thought. "The acequia north of town is blocked," he said. "Did you know that?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the focused attention he was already coming to recognize as her default manner. "I knew it was running slow. I didn't know it was blocked. There's debris about 30 yards up. Wouldn't take more than an hour to clear." She studied him for a moment. "Are you offering to clear it?" He looked at the tomatoes she was planting and then back at her. "Seems like somebody should." Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the family of smiles. "The garden does better when the acequia runs clean," she said. "I'd be grateful." He cleared the acequia that afternoon. It took closer to 2 hours than one, and he came back to the boarding house with his boots muddy and his shirt soaked through from where he had waded in to move the larger pieces of deadfall. Mabel saw him from the back porch, assessed the state of his clothes with a single practical glance, and told him she would put extra water on for the washstand. He stood on the back porch dripping, and felt something that he could not immediately name, something in the territory between gratitude and discomfort, the specific unease of being taken care of. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't," she said, and went back inside. He had heard that Mabel Sullivan's husband, Thomas Sullivan, had been a good man who died of a fever 3 years back, leaving her the house and a small amount of money that she had made into a boarding house because she was practical and resourceful and not given to feeling sorry for herself. He heard this from Thomas Weaver, who had been in Dustfall for 8 months and had accumulated local gossip the way young men from Ohio do when they are lonely, enthusiastically and indiscriminately. "She basically runs the town," Thomas said one evening on the porch. "I mean, not officially, nobody would say that, but when Mrs. Callahan's roof started leaking last winter, it was Mrs. Sullivan who organized the men to fix it. And when the school teacher quit in February, she went to the territorial superintendent herself and argued until they sent a replacement. People go to her with problems." George thought about the way people on the main street still crossed to the other side when they saw him coming, and then thought about the way they stopped to talk to Mabel when they passed her on the street, the way they leaned toward her with their troubles like plants toward a window. "She's not afraid of anything," Thomas said, with the admiration of someone for whom fear was a more familiar companion. George thought about her standing in the blue door on that first day, looking at him with those clear gray eyes and reciting her house rules as though his reputation were no more alarming than a change in the weather. "No," he said, "I don't think she is." He started following her. not in any manner that was intentional, or at least that was what he told himself at first. It was just that, when he took his morning walk and she happened to be going to the market, he found himself going in the same direction. When she went to the general store in the afternoon, he sometimes needed things from the general store himself. When she went to deliver a basket to Mrs. Callahan, who was elderly and housebound, he found himself walking along the same street for no particular reason. It was not behavior he recognized in himself. He was a man who had lived his adult life in a manner that was almost entirely solitary in its inner workings, even when surrounded by others. He did not trail after people. He did not adjust his movements to intersect with anyone's, but he could not seem to stop. There was something about Mabel Sullivan that was like a question he could not work out the answer to. She was not beautiful in a way that made men stop talking mid-sentence, which was the only kind of beauty he had previously paid attention to. She was something more than that and harder to define, a quality of aliveness in her face, a specificity of expression, a way of looking at the world that suggested she had thought seriously about most of it and had not been broken by any of what she found. She was the kind of woman who noticed the blocked sequoia and filed it away and would have gotten to it eventually, probably, but who said she was grateful without performing it, without making it into something it wasn't. He did not understand her. He found that he very much wanted to. The people of Dustfall noticed his following before he fully admitted it to himself. He caught Mrs. Galloway, the banker's wife, watching him from her parlor window one afternoon as he happened to be standing on the far side of the street while Mabel talked to the dry goods merchant. Mrs. Galloway's expression was worried in the specific way of someone who has decided they have a duty to intervene. He was not surprised when, 2 days later, a man came to find him. The man was named Ray Calloway, no relation to the Texas gang, and he was the closest thing Dustfall had to a local law. There was no official sheriff. The town was unincorporated and the county sheriff was based in Carson City and came through twice a year, but Ray Calloway was a large, fair-haired man of 35 who had appointed himself to a kind of informal peacekeeping role that the town had accepted because it was better than nothing. He found George outside the livery stable. "I'll be direct," Ray said, because he was that kind of man. "I prefer it," George said. "People are talking about you following Mrs. Sullivan around. Now, I don't know your intentions, and I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt because you've been decent enough since you got here. But she's a respected woman in this town and she's alone, and I want to make sure we're clear on what's expected." George looked at him for a moment. "I'm not following her," he said, which was technically true in the sense that none of it had been planned, and completely untrue in the way that mattered. Ray looked at him with the assessing gaze of a man who had seen enough of life not to be easily fooled. "Just so we're clear," he said. "We're clear," George said. But the next morning, he took his walk, and Mabel was heading to the schoolhouse to drop off a book she had promised the new teacher, and he found himself going that direction because the schoolhouse happened to be near the bluffs where he had gotten into the habit of sitting for an hour in the mornings, watching the desert wake up. She caught him on the street. Not in a confrontational way, she simply fell into step beside him, which surprised him enough that he almost stopped walking. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "I want to say something to you and I would prefer to say it once and have it be understood." He kept walking because stopping seemed too loaded with implication. "All right. I am aware that you have been in my vicinity more than is strictly coincidental," she said, with the same even tone she used to state house rules. "I am also aware that several people in town are concerned about this and have likely spoken to Ray Calloway about it. I am not one of those people because I am capable of making my own assessments." He waited. "You cleared the acequia," she said. "You helped Mr. Ortega carry a delivery of lumber when his boy was sick, and I don't think you knew I saw that. You have not caused any trouble in this town, and you pay your rent on time, and you speak kindly to Miss Agnes even though half of what she says at supper is directed at the wrong person entirely." He was quiet for a moment. "She told me last Tuesday that my father would have been proud of me," he said. "She thought I was someone named Harold." Mabel made a sound that was absolutely a contained laugh. It was small and bright, and it did something strange to the center of his chest. "She does that," she said. "The point I am making is that I see what I see, Mr. Monroe, and I am not afraid of you, and I would prefer that you stop skulking and simply talk to me if there is something you want to say." He stopped walking then, despite what he had decided about not stopping, and she stopped too, and they stood on the dusty street with the morning light coming sideways through the narrow gap between buildings, and he looked at her with all that stillness he carried, and tried to find words for something he had not yet admitted to himself. "I don't know what I want to say," he said, which was more honest than he had intended. She looked at him with those gray eyes that did not look away. "Well," she said, "when you figure it out, I'll be at the house." She continued on to the schoolhouse, and he stood there for a long moment feeling like a man who had been handed something breakable, and had not yet decided whether to hold on or set it down. He went to the bluffs and sat for 2 hours and watched a hawk circle over the desert floor and thought about everything he knew about himself, which turned out to be less than he had assumed. He had grown up in Missouri, on a farm that was always failing, with a father who drank when things went badly, and a mother who was kind and tired in equal measure. He had left at 17 with enough money for 2 meals, and the understanding that staying would kill him slower than leaving would. He had done things he was not proud of, most of them in the years with the Callaway gang, though not all. He had also done things that were not wrong, small things, helping when helping was possible, being decent when decency cost nothing, and he had told himself those things counted for something, though he had not been entirely sure they did. He thought about Mabel Sullivan saying she was not afraid of him. He thought about the way she had told him to stop skulking and talk to her, as if his presence were not threatening but simply puzzling, as if he were a question rather than a danger. He thought he might be in love with her, or something in the early approaches of it, which was alarming because he had never been in love with anyone and was not sure he had the equipment for it. He came back to the house at noon and found her on the back porch shelling peas, and he sat down on the step below her without asking, and after a moment she handed him a handful of pods and he started shelling them too, and they did not say anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable he had felt in longer than he could remember. "I grew up on a farm," he said, eventually. "Missouri," she said. She had heard him mention it or someone had told her. "Missouri," he confirmed. "My mother grew tomatoes. She had the same idea about sheltered spots. Did they come up?" "They did," he said. "Every year she was stubborn about them." Mabel was quiet for a moment, working the pods with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Where is she now?" "She died when I was 12, he said. "Fever." She looked at him briefly, not with pity, which he would have resented, but with a kind of steady acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge that something is true and difficult and real. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was true but did not entirely encompass the thing. "Things that happen when you're 12 don't always stay in the past," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "They don't." They shelled peas in the afternoon light and the world was quiet around them, just the sound of the pods and the distant noise from Main Street and a mockingbird somewhere in the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. And George Monroe sat there and felt the strange, terrifying sensation of wanting to stay somewhere. Thomas Weaver, who had the romantic instincts of a golden retriever and the subtlety of one, mentioned to George the following evening that Mrs. Sullivan had turned down at least 3 offers of courtship in the 3 years since her husband's death, including one from a well-off rancher named Dalton Pierce, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and was considered by most of the women in town to be an excellent prospect. "She seems to like having her own life," Thomas said, with the mild bewilderment of someone who has not yet understood what that means. George thought about what it meant to have your own life. To have built something out of grief and practicality and stubbornness. To have become the person a whole town brought its problems to. To have a garden with tomatoes in a sheltered spot, and a blue door that you painted yourself, and rules for your house that you enforced without hesitation. He thought about what it would mean to be the kind of man that a woman like that might let into that life, and he knew with a cold clarity that he was not currently that man and might never be. He knew what the town knew about him. He knew, more precisely, what the truth was. The Calloway gang had robbed 4 mail stages and a cattle payroll over the 3 years he had ridden with them. He had participated in 3 of those jobs. 2 men had been shot during those robberies, neither of them by him. The shooter had been a nervous young fool named Danny Fitch who had panicked, but George had been there, had been part of the enterprise, and he had not stopped it. He had left when Calloway had started talking about jobs that would involve people getting killed on purpose rather than by accident, because there was a line he had not yet crossed, and he could see Calloway intending to take him across it. Leaving the gang was not a simple matter. He had ridden hard for 3 days before he was sure he was not being followed, and he had a specific understanding that if Calloway's men found him, the conversation would be brief and fatal. He did not think he had been followed to Dustfall, but he could not be entirely certain. He had not told anyone this. He had told no one anything, which was his habit. But the question of what Mabel Sullivan saw when she looked at him, and whether she would still look at him that way if she knew what he had done, was beginning to sit in him like a splinter that was working its way toward somewhere vital. The situation clarified itself, as situations in the West often did, through the arrival of someone else entirely. His name was Carter Fitch, and he was Danny Fitch's older brother, and he rode into Dustfall on a Tuesday morning in June with 2 other men, and the particular quality of purpose that means someone has followed a trail to its end. George saw them from the window of the general store where he was buying boot leather. He stood very still for a moment, watching Carter Fitch look up and down Main Street with the methodical attention of a man who knows what he is looking for, and then George set down the boot leather and went out the back. He did not go to the boarding house. He went first to the livery stable, where he looked at his horse and thought about riding, and then stood there long enough to understand that riding was not what he was going to do. Carter Fitch was not Calloway. Carter Fitch was a grieving brother who had spent 3 years believing that the man who had caused his younger brother to panic and shoot was responsible for Danny's subsequent death by hanging, which was, in a specific and painful way, something George had to carry whether he wanted to or not. Danny Fitch had hanged in El Paso 4 months after the robbery, convicted on the testimony of 3 witnesses. George had left the gang before the trial. He had not testified. He had not gone back. He went to the boarding house. Mabel was in the kitchen and she looked up when he came in through the back door and she saw his face and she put down the pan she was holding. "What's happened?" she said. He told her. Not all of it. He was not ready for all of it yet, but enough. Men had come looking for him. He had been part of something he was not proud of. It was possible things would become dangerous for anyone near him. He said it plainly, without dramatics, and he watched her face while he said it, waiting for the thing he deserved, which was for her to tell him to leave. She was quiet for a long moment. Kitchen light came in through the west window and made everything golden and still. "Did you shoot anyone?" she asked. "No." "Did you intend for anyone to get shot?" "No." She looked at him. "Are these men going to hurt people in this town?" He thought about Carter Fitch's face. "They're after me, not anyone else, but if things go wrong..." "Then we should make sure things don't go wrong," she said, and she went to the back door and called for Thomas Weaver to go and find Ray Calloway. He stared at her. She came back to the kitchen and looked at him with those gray eyes. "Close your mouth," she said. "If this needs to be handled, we will handle it properly." "You should send me away," he said, and he meant it, not as a request but as a statement of what made sense. "This isn't your problem. I brought it here." "Mr. Monroe," she said, with a patience that was also a firmness, "I have lived alone and run this household and kept this life together for 3 years, and in that time I have made decisions about who is worth troubling over and who is not. I have made my assessment of you, and I am not inclined to revise it simply because your past has inconvenient features. Now sit down." He sat down. He was not accustomed to being told to sit down. He found he did not mind it. Ray Calloway arrived within the quarter hour, and George told him everything with the door closed and Mabel present because she had simply not left the room, and he found he did not want her to. Ray listened with his arms crossed, his expression going through several stages of complicated, and when George finished, Ray was quiet for a moment. "Carter Fitch," Ray said. "I know that name. He's not a lawman, but he's not an outlaw either. He's just a man with a grievance." "His grievance is not entirely without foundation," George said. "That's a decent thing to admit," Ray said. He looked at Mabel briefly as if checking something. "What do you want to do about it?" "I'll talk to him," George said. "Man to man, I've been running long enough. If there's something I owe him in terms of an accounting, then I'll give him one." Ray nodded slowly. "I'll be there, so will my deputy. We keep it from becoming something it shouldn't be." "Agreed," George said. Mabel said nothing, but when George stood to go, she put her hand briefly on his arm. Just a touch, just a moment, and he looked at her. And she was looking at him with something in her expression that he had to look away from because it was too much to hold while he still had something difficult to do. The meeting with Carter Fitch took place that afternoon, in the open space in front of the Silver Spur, which was not ideal but was at least public. Carter Fitch was a hard-faced man of 32, with the look of someone who has been sleeping badly for years. His two companions stayed back at Ray's direction, and Ray and his deputy stood at a careful distance that was close enough to intervene and far enough to allow words to be spoken privately. George walked up to Carter Fitch and looked at him directly. "I know why you're here," George said. Carter Fitch looked at him with 3 years of grief in his eyes. "Then you know what I want." "Tell you everything that happened," George said. "Exactly as it happened. No part of it makes me look good, and I'm not going to try to make it. Danny panicked because it was his first job, and Calloway put him in a bad position, and the rest of us were too busy thinking about ourselves to see it coming. That's the truth. I should have seen it. I didn't." Carter Fitch stared at him for a long moment. "You left before the trial," he said, and his voice was rough. "My brother hanged and you rode away." "Yes," George said. "I did. There is nothing I can tell you about that which makes it anything other than what it is. I was afraid and I ran, and your brother died, and I have not been comfortable in my own skin since." The silence between them stretched out like the desert itself, flat and merciless. "He was 19, Carter Fitch said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away for a moment, out toward the bluffs. "I know," George said. "I'm sorry. It's not enough, but it's what I have." Carter Fitch looked back at him. There were a dozen ways the next minute could go, and George was prepared for most of them. But what happened was that Carter Fitch let out a long, shaking breath, and his shoulders dropped about 2 inches, and the hardness in his face became something more like exhaustion. "I wanted to hate you enough to do something about it," Carter said. "I've been carrying it for 3 years, but you're standing there telling me the truth, and I'm tired." "You can hate me," George said. "I'm not asking you not to." "I know you're not," Carter said. He looked at him for another long moment. "Calloway's dead, you know, killed by a federal marshal in Texas 3 months ago." George felt something shift in him. "I didn't know." "I thought you'd want to know," Carter said. He seemed to have run out of what had brought him there. He looked around at Dustfall, at the dusty street and the wooden buildings and the handful of people who had come out to watch from a careful distance. "I'll be riding on," he said. "All right," George said. Carter Fitch turned and walked back to his companions, and they mounted up and rode south, and George stood in the middle of the street watching them go, and it was over, and he felt something very close to clean. He heard a sound and turned. Mabel was standing on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store, 20 feet away, with her hands folded in front of her and her bonnet slightly askew, as though she had come quickly and straightened it on the way. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something open and uncertain, which was unusual enough on her face that it stopped him where he stood. He walked to her. "It's resolved," he said. "I heard," she said. She was quiet for a moment, and the uncertainty in her expression did not go away, which made him think it was not about Carter Fitch at all. "You could have ridden," she said. "This morning when you saw them, you could have just gone." "I know. Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long moment. She had flour on her cuff again. She had rushed out of the kitchen to watch him face down his past, and she had flour on her cuff, and she was looking at him like he was a question she had been turning over in her own mind. "I didn't want to leave," he said, which was honest to the point of being almost painful. "I haven't wanted to be anywhere in a very long time, and I found somewhere I wanted to be, and I wasn't willing to let it go without at least trying to deserve it first." Her breath came out in a quiet rush. "George," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her mouth in that clear, unhurried voice was the best thing he had heard since his mother used to call him in from the fields. "Mabel," he said back, deliberately, carefully, like something being set in a place where it would stay. She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up at him, and the uncertain expression was still there, but it had something else in it now, something that was quietly incandescent. "I think," she said, "that you should perhaps buy me supper at something other than my own table." He understood what that was. He was surprised enough that he did not speak for a full 3 seconds, and she waited through those 3 seconds with the patience of a woman who is very sure of what she has said. "I will do that," he said. The Silver Spur had a back room with proper tables and a cook who could produce a decent steak on her best nights, and that was where they went. And for the first time in his adult life, George Monroe sat across from a woman and talked without an agenda, without a performance, without calculating what he should or should not say. He told her about Missouri. She told him about Kentucky, where she had grown up, the third of 5 children, daughter of a blacksmith who was also an amateur beekeeper and kept hives behind the workshop. She told him about coming west with Thomas Sullivan, who had had a dream about land and a cattle operation that had been less practically supported than the dream required. She told him about nursing him through the fever that took him, and about the specific grief of losing someone before you had entirely finished building your life together with them, and about the decision to make something of the house rather than sell it and go back east. He listened to all of it with the complete attention of a man who has found the one thing he wants to pay attention to. "You never went back to Kentucky," he said. "There is nothing there I cannot visit," she said, "and everything I have built is here." He thought about what it meant to build something. He had built nothing. His entire adult life had been a series of places he had passed through, and the only things he had made were trouble and distance, and eventually, the small transaction of a cleared acequia and a handful of shelled peas. "I don't have much to offer you," he said, and he said it plainly, not as false modesty but as an honest accounting. "I have a horse and some money that is not from anything I am proud of and a skill set that mostly involves being able to shoot things and not get shot." She tilted her head and looked at him with a slight smile that was more warmth than humor. "Mr. Monroe, I'm a widow who runs a boarding house in an unincorporated town in Nevada," she said. "I did not ask you for anything. I asked you to supper." "You called me by my first name," he said. "Earlier." She looked at him and the smile deepened. "I did," she said, "and I stand by it." He was 31 years old, and he was sitting in the back room of a saloon in a mining town in Nevada, and he was looking at a woman with rain-colored eyes who had flour on her cuff and who was not afraid of him, who had never been afraid of him, who had looked at him from the first moment with that clear, steady, uncommitted gaze and seen something. He did not know exactly what she had seen. He very much wanted to spend a long time finding out. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would consider." She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the whole saloon seemed to hold itself still around them, the rough voices in the front room muffled to nothing, the out-of-tune piano silent. "Yes," she said, "I would consider it." He walked her home along 2nd Street in the dark, with the stars thick overhead the way they only are in desert country, where there is no city light to compete with them. And at the blue door she turned and looked at him and he looked at her, and there was a moment that was full of everything that had not happened yet. And then she said good night and went inside, and he stood on the porch for a moment with his hand flat against the painted door before he went upstairs to his room. He lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and he thought that something was beginning that he did not have a map for, and for once in his life that did not frighten him at all. The following weeks had a particular quality. Dustfall's residents noticed the change in their arrangement immediately, because small towns notice everything immediately, and the collective opinion divided along predictable lines. Some people, Mrs. Galloway chief among them, disapproved of Mabel Sullivan keeping company with a man whose past was what it was. Some people, Miss Agnes Foy, operating on partial information about who George was but excellent instincts about character, approved enthusiastically. Ray Calloway fell somewhere in the middle, which he expressed by continuing to watch George without actively interfering with him. George and Mabel were, by any formal measure, quite proper in their courtship. He called on her in the evenings after supper, and they sat on the front porch and talked, and occasionally they walked in the late afternoon before supper along the edge of town where the desert started, and once he took her out to see the bluffs at sunset because he had been watching that sunset for weeks and wanted to show someone. She stood beside him on the red rock and watched the desert go through its colors and did not say much, which was right, because some things are diminished by speaking about them too quickly. "Do you think you'll stay?" she said eventually, as the light was going. It was the question he had been carrying for weeks, the one he had been turning over and working through with the particular care you give to something that matters. "I think I want to stay," he said. "Whether I can make myself useful enough to justify it is a separate question." She turned and looked at him. "What would useful look like to you?" He thought about it seriously because she asked it seriously. He knew horses. He knew land in the way a farm boy never stops knowing land, even after years away from it. He knew enough about carpentry to be helpful even if not expert. He knew how to work hard, which was not nothing. "There's land north of here," he said. "I've been riding out past the bluffs in the mornings. There's a quarter section that looks workable if you had water rights. I could build something on it. It would take time, but I could build something." She looked at him with an expression he was learning to read, the one where she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking or the safer adjacent thing. She chose the actual thing. "George," she said, "are you telling me about a piece of land in relation to a future that includes me, or are you making conversation?" He looked at her directly. "I am not in the habit of making conversation about land," he said. The smile that crossed her face then was a different kind from any he had seen yet. Not the contained amusement, not the warm professionalism, but something private and wholly pleased, like a door opening into a well-lit room. She looked back at the desert and he looked at her profile against the dark red sky and understood in a way that allowed for no ambiguity whatsoever that he was entirely in love with her, and had probably been so for at least a month, and that there was no version of his future that he wanted to consider in which she was not centrally present. "Tell me about the land," she said. He told her. He had been thinking about it more carefully than he had let on, the quality of the soil, the angle of the slope, the way the water table might be reached, the question of whether cattle or horses would be the better enterprise for the specific terrain. She listened and asked questions that were precise and practical, and somewhere in the middle of her asking about the water rights and him explaining what he had learned from a man at the assay office, they had stopped looking at the desert and were looking at each other, and they were standing closer together than they had been, and the conversation about land had become something else entirely. He kissed her. It was not planned. Or it was, in the way that anything is planned when you have been thinking about nothing else for weeks, but it happened at the right moment, which was the moment she paused mid-question and looked at him with something so open and certain in her expression that waiting any longer would have been wrong. He put one hand against her cheek, which still had the warmth of the day in it, and he kissed her very carefully, the way you handle something you do not want to damage." She kissed him back, which was less careful and more certain, and she put one hand against his chest over his heart, and they stood on the red rock bluffs in the last of the Nevada sunset, and he was 31 years old, and it was the first time in his life he had kissed anyone and meant it down to the bone. When they pulled back, she kept her hand on his chest and looked at him with those gray eyes that had never once been afraid of him. And he looked at her and thought that all the years of bad decisions and hard riding and running had brought him to exactly this bluff at exactly this sunset, and he was not inclined to regret the road if this was where it ended. "I think," she said in her clear and even voice, "that you should probably speak to me formally and soon." "Tomorrow," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, full and bright, out there on the empty bluffs with nobody to hear it but him and the hawk that had been watching them from a dead mesquite branch, and it was the best sound the desert had ever produced. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He did speak to her the next morning, formally, properly, sitting in the front parlor of the boarding house with his hat in his hands and the sunlight coming through the clean curtains, and he asked her if she would marry him, and he told her first, without prettying it, exactly what she was saying yes to if she said yes: the past, the reputation, the fact that he was starting from nothing, the understanding that they would be building something from the ground up. She listened to all of it. Then she said yes. She said it without qualification, and without the particular hesitation of someone talking themselves into something. She said it the way she said everything, as a decided thing, clear-eyed and completely her own. He took her hands, which were warm and strong and had flour on them again, and he held them very carefully, and she looked at him with those rain-colored eyes, and he thought he understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant to be home. The town of Dustfall received the news of their engagement with the full range of reactions that small towns bring to such events. Mrs. Galloway had 3 separate conversations with her neighbors about the wisdom of the match. Thomas Weaver, who had perhaps seen it coming more than anyone, celebrated by buying everyone at the Silver Spur a round of drinks, which cost him more than he had intended but which felt right. Miss Agnes Foy grabbed George's arm at supper and told him, apparently believing him to be Harold again, that he was a lucky man, and she expected him to behave accordingly. Ray Calloway came to find him the following morning. George expected another warning. What he got was something different. "I want you to know I've sent some wires," Ray said, "about what you told me regarding the Calloway gang and your involvement. I contacted the marshal's office in El Paso and the territorial court in Austin." George went still. And, Ray said, with the careful deliberation of a man delivering complicated news, "given that Calloway is dead, given that Danny Fitch is dead, given that the primary surviving witnesses to the robberies have either relocated or are unavailable, and given that the federal marshal's office has confirmed you were not the shooter in either incident and left the gang before the final jobs, there is no active warrant for you. There was a notice posted 18 months ago that has since been cleared." George was quiet for a moment. "Why did you do that?" Ray looked at him steadily. "Because you handled Carter Fitch with honesty and courage, and because Mabel Sullivan has better judgment than any 3 other people in this town combined, and if she's decided you're worth having, then I am inclined to think the legal situation should match the truth of the matter." George looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his chest that was not entirely comfortable, the feeling of something large and knotted beginning to come undone. "Thank you," he said. It came out roughly, which he could not entirely help. Ray clapped him on the shoulder once firmly and walked away, which was the right thing to do. The wedding took place in early September, 6 months after George Monroe had ridden into Dustfall on his gray roan horse, and made everyone on the main street find something urgent to look at on the ground. It was a clear, warm day with the kind of sky that Nevada produces in September, a blue so deep and complete that it looks painted, with clouds like torn cotton along the western horizon. The church served, as it usually did, double duty. The schoolchildren had been dismissed early, and someone had put bunches of dried wildflowers along the pews, which was the best that late summer in the desert could offer and turned out to be more than enough. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from San Francisco, a cream-colored lawn with small embroidered flowers at the collar. She wore her brown hair pinned up with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's, sent from Kentucky for the occasion, along with a letter that George was not shown, but that made Mabel cry in the good way. The way that means you are crying because something matters rather than because something is wrong. George wore his best clothes, which were not extravagant but were clean and pressed, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Mabel walk down the aisle, and felt the specific terror and wonder of a man who cannot quite believe the luck that has found him. Miss Agnes Foy cried throughout the ceremony and called George Harold twice and told him he was doing very well. Thomas Weaver was best man, a role he had been given after he had asked George directly if he needed one, with the directness of someone who very much wanted the role and was not willing to be subtle about it. He took the responsibility seriously and did not lose the ring. The pastor, a young man named Reverend Price who had been in Dustfall for 8 months and was still slightly overwhelmed by the place, read the words in a clear voice with evident feeling for the occasion. And when he came to the part where George was asked if he took this woman, George said he did with a quiet certainty that carried to every corner of the small church. When he kissed her at the altar, it was not tentative, because there was nothing tentative between them anymore. And there was a sound from the assembled guests that was not quite a cheer but was adjacent to one. And Miss Agnes Foy clapped her hands and said, "Well done, Harold," and everyone pretended not to hear. The quarter section of land north of the bluffs did have workable water rights, as George had believed. He had spent the months of his courtship working to secure them, and also building, with the help of several men in town who had warmed to him over the summer. Among them the lumber merchant, who had accepted his help with that first delivery, and Mr. Ortega, who had 2 sons who were strong workers, and who felt that George Monroe had proved himself worth knowing. The house that was beginning to take shape on that land was modest but solid, made from good lumber and built to last, with a kitchen garden site he had prepared, and a sheltered spot on the south side that he had specifically planned for tomatoes. He had not told Mabel about the tomato spot. He was keeping it. It seemed important to have something to show her. They spent the first weeks of their marriage in the boarding house while the land house was finished, which was perfectly comfortable because it was, after all, her house. Thomas Weaver continued to rent his room with the cheerful insensitivity of a young man who sees no reason why a newly married couple should want private space, until Edwin Pratt happened to mention something to him, and Thomas went pink to the ears and was very apologetic for about 3 days before returning to his normal state. The house was finished in October, and on the day they moved in, George brought Mabel around the south side and showed her the sheltered garden spot. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. She knew what she was looking at, the specific angle of the wall, the way he had oriented the garden beds to catch maximum warmth, the deep, prepared soil. "Tomatoes," she said softly. "Every year," he said, "if you're stubborn about them." She turned and put her arms around him, which she did not always do in the practical light of day, and he held her with the certainty of a man who has learned how to hold something carefully and has decided to hold on. The first winter in their house was cold and quiet and entirely good. George broke the land in stages, methodical and patient, learning its specific character, where the soil was rich and where it was thin, where water sat after rain, where the frost came early. He bought 3 horses and began the careful business of a breeding program, because horses were what he knew and what the territory needed, and he was good at reading what a horse needed and what it could give. He rode into Dustfall most days for supplies or conversation, and the town had changed its relationship with him in the slow, inexorable way that towns do when they have had enough evidence to adjust their opinions. He was not loved the way Mabel was loved. She had years on him in that regard, and a quality of warmth that was simply hers. But he was known, and knowing in a small town is worth considerable. Mabel continued to run the boarding house through the winter, riding in from the land house each morning, because the boarding house provided income while the land was still establishing itself, and because, she said, she was not inclined to abandon Miss Agnes Foy to a series of strangers. George accepted this with equanimity, and found that he enjoyed the evenings when she came home to the land house and sat across the supper table from him and told him what had happened in town, her voice carrying the specific warmth of someone who is genuinely interested in the people around them. He told her in return about the horses, about what he had found in the land, about the small and large things of a life that was being built from scratch. They talked every evening for as long as they wanted to, and it never ran dry. In the spring, she told him she was expecting. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when she told him, and he set the cup down very carefully, as though sudden movements might disturb something, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was that the quality of stillness he always carried had become something different, not cold stillness but warm stillness, the stillness of a man who has stopped moving because he has arrived. "Are you happy?" she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with those dark eyes that had frightened half a town and had never once frightened her. "Mabel," he said, which was still sometimes his entire sentence. "Good," she said, "because I am very happy and I would prefer you to share it." He kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his and they stood in their kitchen in the spring morning with all of it in front of them. Summer came back to Dustfall with its full heat, and Mabel's condition began to be visible, and the town received that piece of news with the same mixture of warmth and gossip that it applied to everything. Miss Agnes Foy was delighted and told everyone she saw, whether or not they had asked. Thomas Weaver sent a letter from Ohio, because he had finally gone home, full of congratulations that were warm and slightly misspelled. Ray Calloway stopped George on the street and shook his hand and said something brief and sincere about expecting the child to be a credit to them both. Mrs. Galloway, after a period of internal negotiation that George was not privy to, arrived at the boarding house one afternoon with a handmade quilt and handed it to Mabel without comment, which was more than anyone had expected, and which Mabel accepted with the precise degree of grace that the moment required. "That's something," George said, when Mabel told him that evening. "It is," she agreed. "She's a complicated woman, but she makes beautiful quilts." The tomatoes came up that summer in their sheltered spot, which Mabel had planted in April with the focused attention she brought to everything, and they were the finest tomatoes George had seen since his mother's garden, fat and deep red and warm from the sun. He ate one standing in the garden one morning in July and thought about Missouri and his mother and the long crooked road that had brought him here, and he felt something that was not quite peace because it was too alive for that, something more like rightness, the feeling of a thing being in the place it was meant to be. The child was born in November, on a cold, clear night when the stars were out in their desert fullness, in the bedroom of the land house with the doctor present and Mabel's friend Clara, who had become the closest thing to a best friend in Dustfall, serving as the practical support that the half-blind, periodically drunk doctor could not reliably provide. George was outside, because that was what men did, and because Mabel had told him firmly that she would be fine and he was not to wear a path in the floorboards. He did not wear a path. He stood on the porch and looked at the stars and had a conversation with himself that was not entirely verbal about what it meant to be a man who had been given more than he deserved and what he intended to do with it. The baby was a boy, and he was healthy and loud and had, according to Clara, the most determined expression she had ever seen on an infant, which they all agreed was probably unavoidable given his parentage. George was brought in and stood at Mabel's side and looked at this new person they had made, red-faced and furious and already entirely himself, and felt something that broke through all the words he had ever known and left him simply standing there with his wife's hand in his and the whole of the future in the room. "What shall we name him?" Mabel said. She was tired in the deep way of someone who has done something enormous and done it well, but her gray eyes were bright. He thought about it. He thought about his mother in Missouri and about Thomas Sullivan who had died too soon and about the long chain of things that had brought them to this room. "James," he said. "James Thomas Monroe." Mabel looked at him with an expression that was full to its edges. "James Thomas," she repeated softly, and the baby, as though recognizing something, stopped crying. The years that followed in Dustfall were the years of a life being built in the patient, incremental, genuinely joyful way that lives are built when the people doing the building are the right people for each other. George's horse operation grew steadily, developing a reputation across the territory for producing reliable, well-tempered working horses that commanded a fair price and earned repeat customers. He hired 2 ranch hands, young men named Felix and Peter, who were decent workers and who treated the Monroe land with the respect of people who knew they were working somewhere good. Mabel gave up the boarding house in 1886, 3 years after the wedding, when Miss Agnes Foy went to live with a niece in Sacramento, a departure that involved a 3-hour farewell in which Miss Agnes addressed most of her final statements to George, calling him Harold throughout, and which left Mabel crying in the good way again in the kitchen, while George stood in the doorway and pretended not to notice. The house was sold to a young couple from Utah who had come to Dustfall looking for a start, and Mabel directed her considerable organizing energies toward the land house and the raising of James, who was proving to be everything his determined birth expression had promised: curious, forthright, already in possession of opinions about horses at the age of 2. George watched his son watch horses from the fence with those dark eyes that were entirely his own, and something in him settled so completely that there was no unsettled thing left to locate. Thomas Weaver wrote from Ohio that he had married a schoolteacher's daughter named Helen, and that they were expecting their first child in spring, and he wrote with the specific happiness of someone who had finally found their version of the thing he had watched George and Mabel find first. George wrote him back a longer letter than he usually wrote anyone, which was not saying much, but which Thomas later told his wife was the nicest letter he had ever received from a man who was not related to him. Ray Calloway died in the winter of 1887, unexpectedly, of a heart complaint that had been quiet until it wasn't. The town mourned him genuinely, because he had been a good man doing a necessary thing, and George carried the coffin along with 5 other men, and stood at the graveside and thought about the wire Ray had sent to El Paso on his behalf, and felt the specific weight of a debt that cannot be repaid, and has to instead be honored by living well. The winter after Ray's death, the town voted formally to incorporate, and with it came a properly appointed sheriff from the county, a young man named Sheriff Barnes who was 26 and competent, and who quickly learned that George Monroe was a reliable person to consult when things needed settling outside of the strictly legal parameters of his authority. It was an informal arrangement, but it was not unlike the one Ray had made, and it suited both of them. James was 4 when Mabel told George she was expecting again, and this time she told him over supper, straightforwardly, with James present, because James was at the age where he noticed when things were being said around him rather than to him and protested it with impressive vigor. "There will be a new baby," Mabel said, addressing them both equally. James considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all significant developments. "Another horse baby," he said, because he had recently observed the birth of a foal and had formed a theory. "A person baby," George said. James thought about it. "All right," he said, and went back to his supper with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has been raised by parents who took his questions seriously. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1888 in the same bedroom where James had been born, with the same stars and the same desert dark outside the window. She came with considerably less difficulty than James and considerably more hair, which she seemed to have strong feelings about, and she was named Caroline. Caroline Eleanor Monroe, after both grandmothers in a compromise that satisfied the correspondence from Kentucky considerably. George held her in his arms in the early morning, standing at the bedroom window while Mabel slept the deep sleep of someone who had earned it, and he looked at this second new person and thought about all the versions of himself he had been, and all the roads he had not taken, and the single road that had brought him to a blue door in Dustfall, Nevada, and a woman who had looked at him without fear and seen something worth keeping. He thought about his mother's tomatoes, and about Carter Fitch's tired face, and about the sound of Mabel laughing on the bluffs at sunset. He thought about Ray Calloway shaking his hand outside the livery stable, and about the feel of the bluffs under his feet on Sunday mornings when the desert was quiet, and the light was clean, and the world was nothing but space and stone and possibility. He thought about the question he had followed Mabel around like all those early days in Dustfall, the question he could not answer, the question that was just her presence, just the fact of her, just the thing she was that he did not have words for and had followed out of sheer bewilderment at his own longing. He thought he understood the question now. It had been simpler than he knew. The question had been whether a man could be made into something better than what he had been, whether the road behind him was the whole story or only the first part of it. He had followed her around like that question because she was the only person who had ever looked at him and not answered the question with fear, who had left it open, who had seen him as someone whose answer was still being written. She had been right, which was consistent with her record. Little Caroline made a sound in her sleep, a small, decisive sound, and settled more firmly against his chest with the authority of someone who has decided where she is and approves of the location. And George Monroe stood at the window with the desert and the stars before him, and held his daughter and knew, with the completeness that only comes from having earned something difficult and carried it all the way home, that the answer to every question he had ever followed through the dust and distance of his life was sleeping down the hall and lying in the room behind him, and standing in the kitchen garden on a spring morning pressing tomato seedlings into prepared ground. By the spring of 1889, the Monroe land had become something that people in and around Dustfall spoke of with a specific kind of respect, not the respect of envy or of awe exactly, but the respect of knowing something has been done properly. The horse operation was the finest in the county now, with George having developed a particular understanding of quarter horses that made his lines sought after by ranchers from as far as Utah and Northern California. The house itself had been added to twice, carefully, with rooms that fit the needs that presented themselves. A larger kitchen that Mabel had requested with specificity, and that George had built over a winter to her exact requirements. A room for James that would be his own as he got older. A south-facing sunroom that caught the winter light, and that contained, among other things, a rocking chair that Mabel used in the evenings and a bookshelf that George had made himself, and that was fuller every year. James, at 6, had already developed a specific gravity around the horses, a talent that was not taught but recognized, the way certain children recognize a language they were always going to speak. He could sit on a fence post for an hour watching the mares in the paddock, and tell you afterward things about their moods and movements that grown men who worked with horses did not always notice. George watched this with the particular pleasure of seeing something of himself in his son that was the best part of himself. Caroline, at 1, was interested in everything and fearless about investigating it, which meant that she required a degree of active supervision that kept the whole household alert. She had Mabel's gray eyes and George's dark hair, and she had opinions about every meal, every item of clothing, and every horse, which she expressed in the forceful preverbal language of someone who has a great deal to communicate and is working through the vocabulary problem with all available urgency. Dustfall itself had changed in the 6 years, since George had ridden in on his gray roan horse. The incorporation had brought a proper sheriff's office and a small schoolhouse that was now separate from the church. A second general store had opened, which had generated considerable tension between its owner and old Hawthorne until they had reached a territorial agreement. The Silver Spur had a piano that was now in tune, following an ultimatum from the musician's wife that George privately felt deserved wider recognition. 3 new families had come in from Texas and Missouri, good working families who had added to the town's character without substantially changing it. George was known in Dustfall now in the way you are known when you have been somewhere long enough and done enough good work. Not as what you used to be, but as what you are. And what you are is woven into the fabric of a place in ways that are harder to pull out than people expect. He had helped build the new schoolhouse alongside 4 other men, and he had contributed to the fund for the teacher's salary when it came up short in 1887, and he had ridden out with 3 other men when a family's cattle had scattered in a late spring storm and spent 2 days helping gather them. These were not extraordinary things. They were the ordinary things of someone who has decided that being part of a place means participating in its difficulties. On an evening in late April of 1889, George and Mabel sat on the porch of their land house after supper, which was their habit on warm evenings. James was inside doing the reading that his teacher had assigned him with the heroic but imperfect commitment of a 6-year-old who would rather be outside. Caroline was asleep. The desert was doing its evening performance, the colors, the cooling air, the first stars appearing in the east while the west was still faintly lit. Mabel was knitting something, which she did in the evening sometimes, her hands moving with the automatic ease of long practice while her eyes were on the distance. George was watching the horses in the near paddock, watching the way they moved in the last light, checking with the perpetual background attentiveness of a man who knows each animal specifically. "Do you remember," Mabel said, without looking up from the knitting, "when Claude at the Silver Spur told you about the boarding house, that first day?" He remembered it precisely. "He told me you had a rule about firearms." "He did," she said, amused, "and you thought it was sensible. It is sensible." "I am sensible," she said, with the warmth in her voice that meant she was teasing him, which she did on a regular basis and which he had learned to receive with equanimity mostly. "Remarkably so," he said. She was quiet for a moment, her hands moving in the fading light. "I remember thinking when I opened the door that first morning," she said, "that you looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time." He looked at her. And I thought it was a shame," she said simply, "whatever you'd been carrying, because underneath it you were obviously worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment with that. "You had no reason to think that." She looked at him then, and in the evening light her gray eyes were exactly the color he had first seen in them, the color of sky before rain, the color that did not judge or fear. "I have very good instincts," she said, "as you know." He reached over and took her hand, the one that was not working the knitting, and she let him, and he held it with the careful certainty of a man who has learned the precise weight of what he is holding and has no intention of putting it down. "Mabel," he said. "George," she said, which was still sometimes all the conversation required. The stars came out fully now, the whole extravagant desert sky turning its face to the dark and showing everything. James appeared in the doorway behind them and announced that he had finished his reading, which was probably not entirely true but deserved the benefit of the doubt, and Mabel told him he could sit with them for a while before bed. He came and sat on the porch steps and leaned against his father's leg with the unself-conscious affection of a child who has never been given a reason to guard himself, and George put a hand on his head, and they all 3 sat there looking at the desert and the sky. This was what he had come to. This was the answer to every road he had ever ridden. Not a destination he had aimed for, not a plan or a calculation, but a blue door and a woman with clear eyes who had not been afraid, who had handed him a handful of pea pods and told him to stop skulking, who had stood in a church on a September morning, and said yes with the completeness of someone who had thought it through and known her own mind, who had put her hand on a sheltered spot in their garden and pressed tomato seedlings into dark soil every spring like a statement about persistence and warmth and the future. George Monroe sat on his porch in Dustfall, Nevada, on an April evening in 1889, with his son against his leg and his wife's hand in his and his daughter asleep inside, and the whole desert breathing in the dark around them. And there was not one single thing in his life that was not resolved, not one thread left loose, not one question still circling unanswered. He had been the question once, the thing that followed behind a woman who was not afraid, trying to understand what she saw when she looked at him. He understood now. He had become, slowly and by her grace and his own work, the answer to himself. The tomatoes in the sheltered spot would come up in 2 months, red and warm from the Nevada sun, exactly as his mother's had come up in Missouri, exactly as all things come up when someone stubborn and good plants them in the right place and tends them with care. The desert was vast and silent and beautiful around their small, lit house, and the stars went on forever, and everything that needed to be was whole.